Чому Крим залишається в російських руках?
Why does Crimea remain in Russian hands, and will it continue? What will happen to the indigenous people of the peninsula, with the Crimean Tatars, if Crimea remains under Russian control? Why did Donald Trump say that it is possible to give up Crimea to Russia? About these and other topics, we are talking with Refat Chubarov, the chairman of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars.
Сьогодні з Рефатом Чубаровим, головою Меджлісу кримсько-татарського народу.
Wojciech Jankowski, Pavel Bobolowicz. Black Sky, Stop Fake. Let's begin the interview. Mr. Chairman, let me begin with a quote. Crimea will remain with Russia. President Zelensky understands this. This statement was made, of course, by US President Donald Trump in an interview with Time magazine. Trump repeated his thesis that the Ukrainian peninsula was given to the Russians by Barack Obama and that he himself had nothing to do with it. He also recalled that until 2014, Russia maintained its fleet in Crimea and that most of the peninsula's inhabitants, according to him, speak Russian and allegedly want to belong to the Russian Federation. How do you assess this statement?
Let me start with a quote and then explain its source. The quote reads as follows: "In concert with allies, partners, and the international community, the United States rejects Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and pledges to maintain this policy until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored." До відновлення територіальної цілісності України. This is an excerpt from the so-called Crimean Declaration, published on July 25, 2018. 2018 року очільником Держдепартаменту. At that time, the US State Department was headed by a person appointed by President Trump. Я дуже сподіваюся, що політика Сполучених Штатів Америки залишатиметься. So I sincerely hope that US policy will remain systematic and consistent, that the US as a country will not deviate from its principles or its official positions, in particular those such as the 2018 Crimean Declaration. Декларації 2018 року.
But if the United States changes its position, and that is what Trump has been saying, and not just in one interview, similar statements are also coming from his advisors, those responsible for foreign policy. Witkoff, who is responsible for negotiations with Russia, speaks in this tone and uses this rhetoric. Perhaps Trump and his administration really did think that way in 2014, and maybe even in 2019, as you just mentioned. And we admit that. We remember that Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State at the time, but perhaps they no longer think that way today. Or, on the contrary, perhaps they are indeed convinced that Crimea is a territory whose majority of inhabitants are Russian.
Attempts to achieve peace or a ceasefire in the Russian-Ukrainian war as quickly as possible are nothing more than a grim joke for the leaders of the United States, and in particular for President Donald Trump. They are trying to decide the fate of a foreign land. One might think that this is about seeking compromises in the name of peace. But if we are talking about a compromise that involves territorial concessions at the expense of another country, then the talks should be conducted with those to whom this land belongs. This is the land of the Crimean Tatar People. It is our homeland, and at the same time, it is an integral part of the Ukrainian state. Therefore, unilaterally proposing such a compromise is, to put it mildly, politically incorrect. This will never happen. We will never agree to someone else deciding the fate of our land. You asked, what if it happens anyway? Yes, theoretically it could happen, but it would mean fundamental changes and shifts in the international order. First, it would be a flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. peoples. I am referring primarily to the rights of the Crimean Tatar people, rights enshrined in numerous resolutions of the UN General Assembly and documents of other international institutions. Such a step would destroy the foundations on which the post-war system of international relations was based. It would spell the end of international law, which would be replaced by the law of force. There would be a shift that would change the very logic of the functioning of the international community. I am not even talking about the violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine as an independent state. If it is accepted that any sovereign state can be treated in this way, it will open the way to legitimizing all crimes committed in the world as a result of aggressive wars. It would essentially be an acknowledgement that if you have an army, armed forces, you can come and occupy someone else's land and the world will eventually accept it. It would also be a complete disregard for the rights of the indigenous people of Crimea, the Crimean Tatar people. Sometimes I speak in a simplified, vivid way, but that is the reality. Crimean Tatars have been murdered on their own land for centuries, starting in 1783 when the Russian Empire occupied Crimea and destroyed the Crimean Khanate, a Tatar state that had existed for 342 years. Regimes and political systems changed. The Russian Empire collapsed and the Soviet Union was created. Then came the time of Stalin. In 1944, the Crimean Tatar population was completely deported. For nearly half a century, the Soviet system forcibly kept us in exile. During this time, Crimea was settled by ethnic Russians and representatives of other nationalities. Everything was changed. Place names were renamed, mosques were demolished, cultural and historical monuments were destroyed. Everything that could remind people of the presence of the Crimean Tatars was eliminated, but we survived, we returned, and we had barely managed to re-establish ourselves in the conditions of an independent Ukrainian state when Moscow invaded again. It invaded Crimea again. What I mean by this is that any politician, regardless of rank, who says, well, we'll have to give Crimea back, let it be Russian, is effectively giving Putin carte blanche to completely destroy the indigenous Crimean Tatar population. I believe that in our pragmatic world, there are few forces capable of going so far. There is no politician in Ukraine itself who would agree to this. And even if someone were to proclaim that Crimea is Russian, Crimea would still not be Russian, neither in spirit nor in essence. It has never belonged to Russia from a legal point of view, and it never will. This only means that the struggle for its liberation will be longer, more difficult, and perhaps more tragic. The price of this liberation may be a new tragedy in human history, the tragedy of another nation, and that nation could be us, the Crimean Tatars. I would very much like to avoid witnessing such a tragedy.
Кримські татари. Я не хотів би, щоб ми стали свідками такої трагедії.
Пане голово, я
Mr.
хотів
President,
спитати,
we here in
ви тут в
Poland,
Польщі, я
and
думаю,
I believe
по
throughout
цілій
Eastern
Східній
Europe,
Європі
believed in the
вірили
United
в
States of America,
Сполучені Штати
in an America that
Америки,
opposed the
які
Soviet Union,
боролися з
that
Радянським
defended freedom,
Союзом, які
freedom of
боролися
speech,
за
freedom of
свободу,
nations,
за
freedom of
свободу
people.
слова, за свободу
And today it turns out that the same
націй,
America wants
народів.
to come
І
to an
зараз
agreement with
виявляється,
Russia.
що ця
How
ж
is this
Америка
possible?
хоче
How did this happen?
договорити з Росією. Як це можливо? Як це могло статися?
Так, це питання, знаєте, воно
Yes,
задається
many
багатьма
people are
людьми.
asking themselves
Люди
this
хочуть самі
question today.
усвідомити,
People want to
що
understand for
відбувається.
themselves
І
what is
питання
going
не
on.
в
And
тому,
it's not
що
just that the
очільники
leaders of the
Сполучених
United
Штатів
States may
можуть
make
іти на
concessions to
поступки
Russia. The
Росії, а
problem is
питання
that
в
they
тому, що
may
вони
yield
підуть
to
на поступки
absolute evil,
абсолютному
lies, and
злу,
injustice. They may take a
неправді,
step toward an
несправедливості.
authoritarian
Вони
regime
підуть
that
на
has
зустріч
unleashed a
авторитарному
war
режиму,
that
який
by all
розв'язав
indications
війну,
may be
що
a
може
prelude to a
стати
new global
прелюдією
conflict.
світової війни. Тобто
This means that the United States of America, which we have always seen and still hope to see as a bastion of democracy and justice, may today side with absolute evil, and that is unacceptable. And it is the possibility of such a scenario that, in my opinion, plunges millions of people into despair. I am not in favor of suddenly transforming the geopolitical architecture or building new security systems, but every nation has the right to defend itself and its state. If the US administration's further steps lead to an even closer relationship with Putin's regime, then, in my opinion, European countries should be the first to react. Politicians, institutions, and societies. They should make an effort to create a mechanism that would be able, if not to replace the power and significance of the United States in defending democracy, then at least to effectively counter Russian aggression in conditions of global instability. In any case, we cannot limit ourselves to merely recording changes that are unacceptable to us. We must discuss real mechanisms for collective defense. However, this must be done in a way that does not alienate the United States. I still believe in the durability of the institutions built in the course of the development of the United States of America. These institutions, thanks to their deep structural coherence and excellence, are capable of protecting the American state itself from a radical departure from its fundamental values and principles. Therefore, the actions of European countries to strengthen collective defense should be carried out in such a way that they do not push the US toward isolationism, but on the contrary are understandable and acceptable to American decision makers. This will allow them to mobilize their own institutional resources and realize that their global responsibility is irreplaceable. I sincerely hope so.
Mr. Chairman, if you allow me, I would like to return to the events of 2014. In your opinion, was the defense of Crimea sufficient at that time?
Completely insufficient. In my opinion, there can be no other opinion on this matter. It seems to me that there is a consensus on this issue in Ukraine. And of course, when we talk about an insufficient response, we often start looking for explanations as to why it failed. And here, different assessments and approaches are possible. I will try to briefly present my position. In my opinion, among the many factors that prevented the effective defense of Ukraine's territories against Russian aggression at that time, primarily Crimea, I would highlight the following key elements. The first factor was the complete discrediting and pro-Russian attitude of key Ukrainian state bodies, which should have guaranteed constitutional order. I am referring to the Security Service of Ukraine, the Prosecutor's Office, the then militia, now the National Police, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and local authorities. At that time, all these institutions were effectively staffed by people with pro-Russian beliefs and values. At the critical moment, instead of defending Ukrainian statehood, they simply sided with the aggressor. Центральне місце посідав кримсько-татарський народ з його і славетною. The second factor was the lack of a coherent state policy towards Crimea as a special territory with a distinct and complex history. The Crimean Tatar people, with their respectable heritage and tragic experiences of recent centuries, occupy a central place in this history.
ще радянська Москва тоді виявилася
By granting
хитрішою, ніж
Crimea
радянський
autonomous
Київ.
status,
Москва
Kiev
спромоглася,
effectively overlooked the
передбачаючи, що
Crimean
повернення
Tatar
кримських татар
factor,
вже не
ignoring the
зупинити,
rights
воно
of
є
a
вже
people returning to
невідворотнім,
their
що
land
кримські
after
татари
deportation.
майже
The year was
півстоліття в умовах
1991.
Радянського Союзу
Paradoxically,
боролися
Moscow
за
at the time,
повернення на
still
свою
Soviet,
землю і
proved to be more
відновлення
forward-thinking than
автономії,
Soviet
і
Kiev.
ця
Realizing that the return of the Crimean Tatars was irreversible, Moscow agreed to the creation of Crimean autonomy. In reality, however, it was an autonomy dominated by the Russian ethnic majority.
етнічної російської більшості. І в Криму
On the eve of the occupation, 500,000 Ukrainians living in Crimea were also excluded from participating in the region's administration. This community remained Soviet in terms of identity, and Kyiv took no action to rebuild its national consciousness and involve it in the processes of state building. In this way, Crimean autonomy effectively transformed into a Crimean Russian entity. Returning Crimean Tatars and the Ukrainian ethnic community were excluded from having any real influence on the life of the peninsula.
Управління цією землею – це був другий фактор, і, можливо, він був головний.
This is the second factor, and perhaps the most important one. There was simply no one to defend Crimea except for the Crimean Tatars. In February 2014, when the Russian invasion began, it was the Crimean Tatars who took to the streets and main squares of towns and villages en masse in an organized and open manner to protest against the occupation and confirm their loyalty to Ukraine and its territorial integrity. However, their forces were too few.
Причиною того, що не було організовано
All these factors led to a situation in which no widespread resistance was organized in Crimea. The authorities that were legally obliged to defend the territory, the Security Service of Ukraine, the Prosecutor's Office, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs failed to fulfill their duties. A significant part of the armed forces of Ukraine also did not take up the fight against the Russian troops. On the contrary, a large part of the personnel defected to the enemy.
So, Mr. Chairman, can we conclude that Donald Trump's allegations regarding Ukraine's failure to defend Crimea are justified? In fact, it sounds as if there was indeed no defense. But if we look at the bigger picture, isn't Ukraine today making every effort to regain Crimea, even after the start of a full-scale invasion? We have witnessed the liberation of territories in the north of the country, but this is only part of a broader process. The issue of Crimea is military, mental, and political in nature. Have the efforts made so far been sufficient? Perhaps force should have been used earlier. You mentioned something extremely important, the change in the structure of the Crimean population, those who today de facto control the situation on the peninsula. Even if we imagine a perfectly executed military operation aimed at liberating Crimea, what would the process of returning this territory to Ukraine look like? What should the reality of deoccupation look like? How would the reintegration of Crimea proceed? And in particular, the return of the Tatar population to their homeland?
Це звинувачення в тому, що Україна
As for the allegations that Ukraine failed to defend Crimea, one could agree with them if they were completely true. However, the whole truth is that when a country in a state of extreme exhaustion falls victim to a powerful superpower, a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto power and one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, it is unfair to accuse it of being unable to defend itself. All the more so because other countries that had committed themselves to guaranteeing Ukraine's security demonstratively failed to fulfill those commitments and refused to provide support. The guarantees given to Ukraine under the Budapest Memorandum did not protect us. And that memorandum did not come out of nowhere. Ukraine voluntarily acceded to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. We had nuclear weapons and gave them up in exchange for security guarantees, particularly from the United States of America. In the first weeks and months, I stayed in Crimea as the chairman of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatars. I made every effort to ensure that we could influence the course of events. In addition to contacts with the Ukrainian leadership, I remained in constant dialogue with representatives of Western countries, I mean ambassadors accredited in Kiev. I testified to this under oath in court. All foreign diplomats, ambassadors, and other representatives of states made one appeal to us, the Crimean Tatars: do not give the Russians a pretext for pogroms, for aggressive actions against the civilian population. Do not provoke them. The international community, we were assured, would soon find ways to resolve the situation peacefully. I am convinced that something similar, albeit in a different form, was also said to the Ukrainian authorities at the time. The world was guided by the logic that the most important thing was not to provoke Russia, and later it was claimed effective ways to resolve the crisis would be found. Yes, Ukraine was helpless at the time, and one can agree with that. But the world also proved to be helpless. Both the United States and China, President Trump talks about Obama, then about Biden. But we are not talking about individuals. We are talking about a country, the United States of America. It was this universal inability, if you will, cowardice, that led us to February 2022, and today the situation has gone even further. That is why the impression arose that Crimea, the land of the Crimean Tatars, could be given back again and again. Everything will be fine, but it will not be fine. The evil spirit has been released, and today it is more important to unite our efforts to drive it back into its lair than to consider how to appease it. There will be no appeasement. Moving on to your question, I am not a prophet who can predict how, when, and in what form the liberation of Crimea will take place. But I know, and I think President Trump understands this too, that under any circumstances, Moscow and especially Putin will hold on to Crimea to the bitter end. They will not give up Crimea voluntarily. How can Russia be forced to give up Crimea? What will be the final argument for them? What factors could influence Moscow to change its position? This should be the task of the united international community. We would like the United States to be with us. When people ask me what needs to happen for Moscow to agree to give up Crimea, I say there needs to be a threat that the Kremlin sees as more serious than losing Crimea. What could that threat be? The collapse of Russia, regime change. Then the Kremlin, wanting to save itself, might agree to lose Crimea. To achieve this, sanctions must be tightened as much as possible, and diplomatic and political pressure must be increased. There can be no skimping on weapons or finances for those who physically oppose Russia. Ukraine is on the front line today, which is why it needs to be supported much more intensively than before.
це відбувається сьогодні. Бо саме
In my opinion, there is only one answer to your question: to bring Russia through sanctions, armed resistance, and isolation in all possible dimensions to a state where Putin's regime faces its own collapse. Yes, it sounds vague, but experts are working on specific solutions.
Ситуації своєї смерті. Я розумію, що це
It seems to me that Putin, even though some still see him as a symbol of Russia, is already on the verge of collapse. This is indicated by the processes of destruction of the Russian economy. Russia is weakening. It is running out of steam. Perhaps this is not immediately apparent because it is a large country with resources, but the process of collapse is ongoing. Putin must now think not only about foreign policy, but also about maintaining control within the country, in his own environment. And it is at this moment that proposals for a truce are emerging, ones that strengthen Putin. If tomorrow someone proposes giving Russia part of Ukraine's territory, it will be another impulse for Putin to further consolidate his control over Russian society.
Ukraine was and remains the initiator of the Crimean Platform. You have just returned from New York, where you participated in a meeting of the UN Permanent Forum on indigenous issues. You participate in all international forums trying to convey to the world the same words that were spoken here. You emphasize that you are aware of the complexity of the current situation, especially in relations with the United States of America. Although that is a topic for a separate discussion, our partners remember both their commitments and the declarations adopted under the Crimean Platform, as well as the words of President Andrzej Duda, who clearly stated, "Can law and principles be subordinated to the interests of individual states?" This question does not apply only to the United States. It applies to the entire West. The United Nations should also remember its commitments. Has everyone really forgotten about Crimea after Donald Trump's statements?
I would like to believe that everyone remembers their obligations and will fulfill them. But you understand this, and I am coming from the same assumption. A great deal will depend on how the Ukrainian state, that is, all the citizens of our country, behave in this situation. I reject the cynical and open betrayal on the part of the world, especially those countries that are well aware of the essence of Russian imperial policy. I am referring to countries that themselves experienced a period of communist domination by the Soviet Union. Although they are now part of the European community, some of their leaders are still waiting for the right moment to, as they say, lend a hand, that is, to intervene for their own benefit. One such politician is Viktor Orban. This is obvious, although perhaps not all politicians realize it. I understand that the modern world is extremely pragmatic and no one expects your complaints or tears. But I often think that we do not want the Crimean Tatars to be merely an object of pity. We want everyone to realize that if we do not defend the Crimean Tatars now, and in fact Ukraine, the same tragedy will befall those who could have prevented it but did not. I believe that the most important thing today is for leading politicians, the leaders of countries, including Ukraine, to realize that the threat hanging over their countries is not hypothetical but entirely real, and this threat will become a reality immediately after the fall of Ukraine. I am talking about the Baltic states, forgive me, but also Poland and Romania. To put it bluntly, I am talking about Russian expansion. It will not stop, and you will be next because you border Ukraine. That is why I would not like to see the actions or omissions of US leaders lead to differences among European countries in their assessment of the current situation. We will continue to work within the Crimean Platform because it is the Crimean Platform established on Ukraine's initiative that has received the most support from European countries, especially the European Union. The European Union as an institution, as a community of free and sovereign states, will increasingly come to the fore. And if, which I would not like to assume, President Trump does indeed announce a unilateral change in policy, recognizes something or states that he does not have the appropriate instruments for action, including within the US, this will be solely President Trump's personal position and nothing more. Even if we allow for the possibility that Trump decides to take such a step, then another institution will come to the fore, the European Union, and it is the EU that will face a real test, because the Russian-Ukrainian war is not the only challenge that could undermine the stability of the European Union.
Пане голово, наприкінці я хотів би спитати...
Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I would like to ask, what is the current situation of the Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula? And what, God forbid, will their future be if Crimea remains under Russian control?
Якби Крим залишився в російських руках.
The occupation of Crimea has been going on for 11 years now. It is obvious that its effects are deeply felt. Children born under Russian occupation are now attending school. We can only imagine what narratives are filling the minds of these children, these young people. And that is what is most painful for us. The most disturbing thing is that the older generation has a kind of immunity, a kind of vaccine formed back in Soviet times. It is this generation that has not accepted, does not accept, and will not accept Russia's presence in Crimea. They will do everything possible, by all means available under occupation, to see the liberation of the peninsula. Russia is using all available instruments to break the will of the Crimean people. This does not only apply to the Crimean Tatars, but to all those who are not loyal to the occupying authorities, and among them are many ethnic Ukrainians. There is a consistent policy of demonizing everything related to Ukraine and its identity. People are afraid to speak Ukrainian. I can confirm this from personal experience. I am almost the only person among my compatriots who still speaks Ukrainian. Propaganda has caused a real psychosis among part of the population, anti-Ukrainian and hostile. As for the Crimean Tatars, they are systematically subjected to persecution and repression. We know that the aim of these actions is to force them to leave Crimea. That is why 2/3 of political prisoners, who, according to various estimates, currently number around 235, are Crimean Tatars. This is despite the fact that, according to census data, they make up only about 13% of the peninsula's population. This clearly demonstrates an attempt to intimidate and drive the Tatar community out of Crimea. At the same time, Russia is actively populating the peninsula with its own citizens. During 11 years of occupation, around 1 million people, mostly ethnic Russians, have been resettled in Crimea. In this way, Russia is transforming Crimea into a military bridgehead for further expansion. In such a bridgehead, there can be no place for people who are disloyal to Moscow. They will be gradually displaced, assimilated, or replaced by resettlers. We have very little time. Sometimes some people say that I speak too calmly, too restrainedly, that my words lack emotion. But please understand, no one wants to witness the extermination of their their own nation, and I can see it happening. When I speak at international forums, when I mention the situation of the Crimean Tatars, many of my interlocutors look away or say, "You're exaggerating, it's not that bad." But it is that bad because we, the Crimean Tatars, know perfectly well where all this is heading. At the end of the 1980s, we barely managed to save ourselves when, despite everything, we began to return to our land, acting independently and with dedication. And that is why, when talking about the future of Crimea and various proposals concerning this territory, we strongly emphasize our voice must be heard. The final decisions will, of course, be made by the Ukrainian state. But I firmly believe that the Crimean Tatar people should also participate in them. We must have that opportunity. And if anyone calls for Crimea to remain under Russian control, claiming that this will save world peace and prevent a third world war, I have to say one thing. These people are wrong, because if we agree to this, there will be no more Crimean Tatars and no more Ukraine itself. And Russia will go further. Where it will stop after Ukraine, I do not know. But one thing is certain, it is easier and more effective to stop it together with Ukraine, and this is still possible. Even now, when Crimea has not yet been liberated, the Ukrainian state must consistently strengthen its position on all issues concerning the peninsula. In 2021, Ukraine adopted a law on the indigenous peoples of Ukraine, but it needs to be followed up with new decisions by the Verkhovna Rada that will guarantee the rights of the Crimean Tatars within the Ukrainian state, including the right to self-determination. Ukraine must make decisions that will show the world what a liberated Crimea will look like and in what direction it will develop. These decisions should include the restoration of all historical place names that were changed after the 1944 deportation. We are talking about approximately 1,500 toponyms. Their restoration will reveal the true face of Crimea. Ukraine must also clearly indicate that Crimea's status as an autonomous region is being transformed into national territorial autonomy based on the indigenous people's right to self-determination. We must present a new model for Crimea, one that is different from the one imposed by Russia, which is transforming the peninsula into a military stronghold. I deeply believe that such a vision will strengthen the conviction of the whole world that the Ukrainian state is fighting and will continue to fight for the return of Crimea as a territory and as the homeland of the indigenous people of Ukraine. Because it is crucial to combine these two elements, land and people.
Mr. Chairman, this was a very difficult conversation, a difficult interview. Many sad and painful words were spoken. Nevertheless, I believe that the day will come where we will drink tea in Crimean Tatar, Ukrainian Bakhchisaray, that it is there together with you, that we will record a new interview, an interview about victory. I believe that this will happen. We wish the Crimean Tatar people victory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.